Hello again and welcome to episode 4 of the Scoring from the 50 podcast. We are jam-packed today. I have my opinion on some documentaries that came out this week, BS High and Swamp Kings, and then the bulk of the show, I have my 2023 college football season predictions. I have predicted every single college football Power 5 game this year. If a Power 5 game is involved, I predicted who would win it. I think I have some things that might surprise you guys. Now to get into it, first one I want to talk about, Swamp Kings. So disappointing. I felt like they could have gone way more in depth with the off the field stuff, and as a younger person who hasn't really experienced 2008, 2009, those areas, I felt like I learned a lot just because I didn't know exactly what happened. Like, I didn't know they lost to Auburn. I didn't know they played Tennessee. I knew they won the championship in 2008, 2006, but I didn't know Chris Leak. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know who Brandon Spikes was. I know who Tim Tebow was, obviously, but it just felt like they could have gone more in depth on the off the field stuff, and they barely talked about it. Whenever what makes those teams so great and so polarizing is the stuff that happened off the field. But it's also how they managed those things and won on the field. Because obviously Urban Meyer, he's a terrible guy, but that documentary made it sound like he was the greatest guy ever and he's such a good coach and how he could handle his team. He coached those guys up, made them really good, but he treated them terribly. I mean, he treated his crap like crap. And no one really had a problem with it for some reason. But, I mean, it worked. They won national championships, but he got terrible people on his team and they never really faced real consequences for their actions. Because the school of Florida kind of just ran everything around Gainesville, and so they would never get in trouble and never really had to pay the price. And Urban Meyer didn't really do anything about it. A couple things I wish they would have talked about is just like Cam Newton, one of the greatest college football players of all time, was on that team. And I don't really know what happened, but I'm pretty sure something happened with him on that team to lead him to not play with them and play at Auburn, obviously, won a national championship. But he's not really talked about in the documentary at all. He's just kind of like the third string after Chris Leak and then Tim Tebow. And then, Cam Newton was recruited 1 year too. Like, another one in that same recruiting class, I think it was Aaron Hernandez. That's a big guy. He's, polarizing, but he's also, a big dude. He's really good tight end for them. Got drafted with the Patriots. Was a killer duo with Rob Gronkowski. Obviously, we all know Aaron Hernandez's story and what happened to him while he was on the Patriots, while he was off the Patriots, what happened to him in high school. If you want to go check out a good Netflix documentary, go watch the one about him. It's super good, goes really into depth into what happened. I didn't know he existed until after I watched that documentary a few years ago, but he was mentioned twice. He was mentioned in the names with Cam Newton whenever they talked about that recruiting class, and then they talked about how Tim Tebow regrets what happened in some bar fight. Like, they didn't really talk about him enough, or, like, even on the football field. Like, I would have liked it if they just talked about how good he was on the football field, because clearly they were trying to stick to football and not talk about the off-the-field stuff. Well, you can't talk about Florida football in the late 2000s without talking about Aaron Hernandez, whether it's on or off the field, because he was a really good tight end. He had just a killer instinct. He really went after those defenses and was one of the best tight ends in college football history. Obviously, we know what happened to him. Terrible, tragic story. His brain was so messed up. Doesn't make what he did right, obviously. He's a terrible guy, but it really feels like you can't talk about late 2000s Florida Gators and not mention Aaron Hernandez on the football field. Because he was a big part of those national championships, big part of those SEC championships. Huge guy. Another one they didn't really talk about, Percy Harvin. Great college football player. They talked about how good he was whenever he got hurt before the 2009 championship, SEC championship that is. But other than that, they didn't really talk about him. But from what I could tell, I don't remember this, obviously. I was 2 years old, but he was this great, dynamic wide receiver and one of the best receivers ever, at least at Florida, and was a main huge part of their offense. I mean, obviously, he went after 3 years to the draft. He was drafted, I'm not sure who he was drafted by it, but I remember watching him with the Seahawks and the Legion of Boom back in those days. He was great, like one of the best players I remember from those great Seahawks teams from the early to mid 2010s. But they didn't really talk about him, even though he was really good at Florida, really good in the NFL, and that's a football thing. I don't know of anything that he did off the field. I'm sure there could be something huge that I'm missing, but I didn't think there was anything bad that he did off the field. I feel like Percy Harvin, if he wasn't in the doc, he could have at least been talked about more, because he barely was. Only people that were really talked about were the people that were in the documentary, and Urban Meyer, Tim Tebow, Brandon Spikes, all those guys. But they didn't really talk about off the field stuff other than a couple things here and there. I think they said, like, yeah, a few of our guys made some bad choices. Yeah, obviously, like, half your team got arrested. And it was just kind of disappointing, because that's why I find, like, I've always found the late 2000 Gators super interesting, right? Because I didn't live through it. I didn't experience any of it, but I was like, oh, that's crazy. They had Tim Tebow, Aaron Hernandez, and Urban Meyer on their team. That's how I learned about it. It was after the Aaron Hernandez documentary. It's like, all three of them? Wow, that's super interesting. I dig a little deeper, and oh my god, they had Cam Newton, the Pouncey twins, all these great football players. And then I dig just a little bit deeper, and it's, oh my god, this team is a bunch of terrible people, and they were all arrested at some point. Well, I was always hoping for a 30 for 30 something on them, and whenever I heard that Swamp Kings was coming out, I was super excited, super hyped. I was like, yes, I'm finally getting this. I'm finally going to get to learn what happened. And then it flopped. It was nothing off the field. Made Urban Meyer seem like a great guy who beat my Michigan Wolverines for 10 years straight, and it's really bummed me out. Really big disappointment. But we're going to move on to a bigger, brighter topic, BS High. That is a great documentary. They made that Elroy Johnson guy seem like this absolute maniac, He's like taking advantage of these poor little high school kids, and it's terrible what he does, but he doesn't have any remorse of it. One of the favorite lines that I thought was so terrible, yet so funny, he goes, the people ask him, they ask, did you ever run over a gaggle of geese? And he goes, a gaggle of geese. Well, I did run over a goose once. And yes, there were multiple. So yeah, that's multiple geese. Yes, I did. Like, he just admits to running over a bunch of geese and doesn't feel bad about it at all. And there was another time where this big guy who, like, really gave him a ton of funds, he was a part of it, and they asked him who he was. That's Elroy Johnson, this terrible guy. They asked him about, like, that guy's name. Like, what was he do? What did he do? What was his involvement in everything? And he goes, who? Oh, yeah, he was involved for, like, a week or two. Oh, yeah, that's not right. It was maybe 6 or 7 months. And then it cuts to the guy just looking like, are you kidding me? And then it cuts back to Elroy, and he's just a huge smile on his face. He is crazy. Like, he took out PPP loans for these 18-year-olds to come play high school football whenever they're JUCO guys. So they're like 21 playing against these high school kids, and they get demolished by IMG on live ESPN. ESPN somehow thought that Bishop Sycamore was this really great Ohio football team. They played at the Canton Hall of Fame game, and they were terrible, obviously. I mean, they don't have a high school. They were like 7-24 in their previous few years. They were so bad. They were not D1 athletes like everyone thought they were, but this guy Elroy Johnson somehow got these players to believe they were. He got these players to believe that if they came and played for him, that they would be this great NFL prospect. And then he somehow duped ESPN into giving him a crap load of money to go play one of the best teams in the country, IMG Academy. That is them and like Mater Dei. That's like the gold standard of prep high school football. All those guys are getting recruited. Every single one on those teams. And they somehow got this fake little high school to go play them on live television. Not like ESPN Plus or something. It was like ESPN or ESPN2, one of those. But it's this fake high school. This guy had somehow duped everyone into thinking that this was this great high school, great college prospects on the team. But it wasn't a real school. And somehow it is completely legal for him to do that. Since it's a religious school, Ohio can't sanction it. And there's no law in Ohio that says you can't fake a school, obviously, because who would think to do that? Well, this Elroy Johnson guy did, and he made a ton of money off of it while screwing over these rest of these high school kids, and he's beating his girlfriend and making fake checks, printing them off. He's terrible, but he somehow seems like a reasonable guy. They make him seem like an everyday human being in the documentary, and that's why I think it's just so good. They talk about what he did and why he did it and why it makes sense for him to do it, but yet he also did these terrible things. So it seems like he's a reasonable guy, but he's not. He's a terrible guy. But you're feeling bad for these high school guys because their life has been ruined. There was the quarterback. He had an offer from Grambling State, a D1 HBCU, but it got taken away once they found out he was from Bishop Sycamore. Like, that is terrible. That poor kid, Elroy Johnson, did this to him. He completely ruined his chances at playing D1 football whenever his pitch to him to come get him to play for him was that you're going to go play D1 football, Power 5 football. And now that he went to Bishop Sycamore, the NCAA, they wouldn't let him play. So why would you offer him a scholarship? But I do think that it was a great documentary. They asked great questions. Elroy Johnson asked great questions. All the coaches, all the adults involved, all the kids. You end up feeling really bad for all of them. But really good documentary. You feel bad for the kids. You feel terrible for them. I mean, their life was ruined, but a really good documentary. If you haven't go see it, go see it. It's on HBO Max or Max, whatever it's called. Go watch. It's hour 45 minutes. Great documentary. Now, moving on to the main event. My predictions for the entire 2023 season. Right here, right now, I'm going to go conference by conference, starting with the Pac-12, then the Big 12, the ACC, SEC, and then the Big 10 to finish it off. To start off, we have the Pac-12. Who wins the Pac-12 this year? I think it's going to be Washington. They go 11-2 with the conference championship win. Oregon finishes as the runner-up. They lost to Washington twice. They lost them once in the regular season and in the conference championship. Washington, whenever they went 11-2, their two losses were to USC and Utah. Speaking of Utah, they are in third. Utah goes 10-2. They lost to Oregon and Oregon State. Speaking of Oregon State, they're in fourth, 10-2. Although they started 10-0, but to end the season with a huge disappointment, they lose to Washington and Oregon. Oregon State could have said a big middle finger to everyone in the Pac-12. 10-0, had a shot to do it, but they lose to Washington and Oregon. Now, you may be thinking there's someone in the Pac-12 I haven't mentioned yet. That is USC. How did they do? They go 10-2, just like the rest of the conference. I have 5 teams going 10-2 in the regular season in the Pac-12. They lost to Utah and Oregon. So, pretty much in the Pac-12, they're all really good teams, but because they're all really good teams, they all cannibalize themselves, all beat each other, and they all end up with 2 losses. None of them make the playoff. Another team that does all right, UCLA, 7-5, they make a bowl, but anyone else just wasn't good enough to really talk about. But great season for Washington and Oregon, heading to the Big Ten. but a disappointing season for the Trojans and Utah. Utah really feel like they could take that next step, maybe go with one loss or instead of two losses, or make the college football playoff instead of winning the Pac-12 and not making it, But the defending two-time Pac-12 champions lost to Oregon and Oregon State. They do not make even the conference championship, while Washington and Oregon do, and Washington beats Oregon for the second time in the season to knock the Ducks out of playoff contention and give them their second loss on the season. Moving on to the Big 12, another very, very competitive conference. I have 3 teams with double-digit wins, and those 3 teams are K-State, Texas, and Oklahoma. In that order, K-State makes a conference championship at 11-2, but they go 8-1 in conference play to make the conference championship against Texas. Texas finishes 10-2. They had lost to Alabama and K-State. They make the conference championship, and K-State beats Texas for the second time in the season to win the Big 12 for the second time in a row. Oklahoma also finishing 10-2, but they lost to Texas and Oklahoma State. And with those 2 conference losses, they would be behind the 2 that went with 1 loss in Big 12 play. Coming up in the rear after Oklahoma, Texas Tech goes 9-3. Great season for the Red Raiders. They're going to have a great recruiting class coming in. Got, I think, what's their first 5-star ever coming in next year. Great building season for Texas Tech as we head into the new Big 12. It's going to be wide open starting in 2024, but they lost to Oregon to begin the season in week 2, and then they go on to lose to Baylor and Texas. Oklahoma State, a surprise team. I really think are going to be really good. Got a transfer from Michigan. I think he's really good. They finished 9-3, just like Texas Tech, with losses to K-State, Houston, and UCF. I think UCF has a alright season here to start their Big 12 play. They end up going 7-5. So, not terrible, but a good start. Good first season in the Big 12 for UCF. TCU, they go 8-4. They start off 7-0, but go on to lose K-State, Texas, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma. So they lose to 4 of the 5 teams that are ahead of them in conference play, but really disappointing after they start 7-0 and only win 1 more game. If TCU were to start 7-0, you know how crazy everyone would be going? This team that just got smacked by Georgia in the championship goes on to start 7-0. It's like, oh my God, they are here to stay. But they go on to lose 4 games. 7-0 to 8-4. Real rough finish for the Horned Frogs. Another 7-5 teams are just Baylor and Houston, kind of middle of the pack. And then Kansas, 6-6 for the second year in a row, barely sneaking into a bowl game. But not a bad season for the Jayhawks from Lawrence. Now, moving on to the ACC. We're going to start off with Notre Dame. I know they're not in the ACC, but we got to fit them in somewhere. They go 9-3 with losses to NC State, Ohio State, and USC. Kind of gives you a look into the future of, how NC State's going to do, how Ohio State's going to do. We'll get to them in a second. But Notre Dame, pretty meh season for Marcus Freeman. But I do think that year 3 jump that he's going to take in 2024 is going to be really, really good for the Fighting Irish. I really believe in Marcus Freeman. I just don't think he's ready to take that next step like I talked about in the last episode and why I have them ranked kind of low. But I think they're going to be good, just not great. Now moving on to the actual ACC. To start off, your conference champs are the Florida State Seminoles. Now you may be thinking, conference champions Florida State? So did they beat Clemson? Or did they beat LSU? Are they in the college football playoff? No. No to both of those questions. They are not in the playoff. They did not beat LSU. They did not beat Clemson the first time. Florida State goes 11-2. They win the conference. They lose to LSU week 1, lose to Clemson week 4, But with only one conference loss, they make the conference championship and then beat Clemson to give them a 10-3 record. Wait. Did I just say Clemson has a 10-3 record? I did. They have 3 losses. Week 1 at Duke. Duke's a good team this year. We'll get to them in a second, but they are really good. Not to be slept on at all, especially going at Duke. They lose week 1. Cade Klubnik is just not ready yet, and they fall week 1. They also go on to lose to Notre Dame, the team that goes 9-3. So they finish the regular season 10-2, but they're still in the conference championship because they only have one conference loss. So they go on to play FSU. They're still fighting for something, playing for a trophy, but Florida State beats them in the rematch of the Week 4 game. Let me tell you, I'm looking forward to that game. We're going to find out how good Florida State is. Week 1, LSU, Sunday night, Mercedes Superdome. It's going to be great. Week 4, at Clemson in Death Valley. You guys can decide what is actually Death Valley, Clemson or LSU, but at Death Valley, they fall in week 4 out of playoff contention within 4 weeks. They start off 2-2, but they go on to win the rest of their games, go undefeated the rest of the season, playing their best football at the end of the season, and that is why I do think that they're going to beat Clemson in the conference championship and take home that ACC championship. Where they go from there in 2024, 2025, who knows? Maybe they announce that at the end of the season they're going to the Big Ten and they just go out on top. They take the ACC championship and get the heck out of Dodge, but they do go out on top. Now, moving on from those top 2 teams, the top contenders, Florida State and Clemson, the 2 actual playoff contenders for this year. Below them, we have NC State. I just mentioned a second ago, they beat Notre Dame, but they lose to Clemson and they lose to Duke. The Blue Devils are really, really good this season. I'm telling you, don't sleep on them. I'm trying to hold back. I'm going to talk about them in a second. North Carolina also goes 10-2. They also start off 10-0, just like Oregon State. I really don't think they're that good, but I think their schedule is pretty easy up until the end of the season whenever they lose 2 straight to Clemson and North Carolina State. As I just mentioned, NC State 10-2. They have a great season. Both Carolinas play great. Now, 8-4 is where we have Louisville, Miami, and Duke. Miami has a great season to build off of going into 2024, where they have a really good class, really good few recruiting classes that I think could really impact how they do in 2024. It's clearly the year that Mario Cristobal has been building to. 2024 is going to be a great year, but 2023 is a great building block. 8-4, making a decent bowl game. They'll be good. Louisville, they also finished 8-4. They just have a great schedule, really easy for them. They beat some good teams. They'll make a good bowl. Duke, they're making a good bowl too. They're good at football this year, not just basketball, but they finished 8-4. Not a bad season. Beat some good teams, North Carolina State, Clemson, but they do lose to Notre Dame. Just kind of one of those teams that's kind of like, are they good? Are they bad? Who knows? But they go 8-4, make a good bowl. And then to finish out the ACC, you got Virginia Tech and Syracuse, both barely squeaking into a bowl game at 6-6. Yes, Virginia Tech is in a bowl game. Syracuse, kind of a down year from last year, but it's Syracuse. They're not really known to have up years. They both make kind of a not good bowl, but they make a bowl nonetheless. Nothing to scoff at if you're the ACC. We'll see what happens with the ACC after this year. Do they have the same fate as the Pac-12? Who really knows? But we'll move on from there. So, Pac-12, Big 12, and ACC have no one in the playoff. All 3 of their conference champions are 11-2, so they don't make the college football playoff. Now, to get to the very, very interesting part, SEC and the Big 10. We'll start in the SEC. Who wins the conference championship? I'm pausing so that you can prepare for this stunner of a pick. Your SEC conference champions in 2023 will be the Georgia Bulldogs. Oh my gosh! No way. Yeah, okay. Georgia's going 12-1, the conference championship, but they lose to Tennessee a few weeks before that conference championship game. Now, this is where it gets interesting. LSU. They are in the conference championship against Georgia. They are 12-1. They're the runner-up, but they lose to Georgia in the championship. So if they've won 12 games, but they also have a loss in the conference championship, then that means that they had an undefeated regular season. Yes, the LSU Tigers have an undefeated regular season. They beat Alabama, they beat Mississippi State, they beat Missouri. We'll get to Missouri in a second. They'll surprise a lot of teams this year. But yes, LSU beats Alabama to win the West. And yes, they are in the college football playoff along with Georgia. We'll get to that at the very end. But Alabama misses out on the college football playoff even though they went 11-1. Only one loss to LSU. Just not a good year. I think that Texas game, they'll win, but I don't think it's going to be by very much. I think that's going to hurt their chances to make the college football playoff. I think not being in that conference championship will hurt them. And I kind of think the college football playoff, the committee just might be sick of watching Alabama. I think they might choose a 11-1 Big Ten team, wink wink, nudge nudge, as their fourth team to make it. So Alabama misses out on the college football playoff for the second year in a row. Moving on, Tennessee. You know they already beat Georgia, but how did they end up with two losses? Well, they play Alabama at Alabama this year, and I just don't see a way that they win that game. Alabama's too talented to win at home, but they also lose to Mizzou. They have a game right before they take on Georgia that I feel like they could be overlooking. Mizzou's a good team. They will be in a few teams. We'll talk about them after we talk about Mississippi State, which is after Tennessee. But the Volunteers, they fall to Alabama. They're looking ahead to Georgia, so they lose at Missouri. I think I might have some content from that game. You know, it's just 3 hours from my house. A few of my friends are talking about going to that game, but we're also talking about going to a Purdue-Nebraska game. We're not sure which one we're going to go to. Depends on one of their basketball schedules in November, but if I had my pick, if it was completely up to me, I would be going to Tennessee at Mizzou. Crazy environment in Columbia. Last year, I drove past the Mizzou and Georgia game. I just drove past it. I was going home from like a band competition, and I saw into that stadium while they were beating Georgia by 2 scores. And that place was rocking. That is something I will never forget. Seeing just how loud and obnoxious those fans were. Listen, my team is 12 hours away. The Michigan Wolverines are 12 hours away from my house. I don't get to go to a lot of college football games. I really fell in love with the sport. Like, really started like, oh my god, that is crazy, after I drove past there. That is something that I saw, and I'm like, oh my god, I need to start going to these games. Because that's a Mizzou. That's at Missouri. They're terrible. They have been since 2014, yet that place is still, like, loud and obnoxious, absolutely packed. I think it was like a blackout game or something, because all of them were wearing black. It was so loud. It was so crazy. They were winning. They were beating the number 1 team in the country. But they were bad, yet they were still so loud. And ever since then, I've been thinking, I need to go to college football games. And that's why this year, I'm determined to either go to Nebraska or to Mizzou, maybe a K-State game. I need to go to at least one game this season, because the only college football game I've ever been to, I went to the Big Ten Championship to see the Michigan Wolverines take on Purdue. And, you know, it was really cool and everything. I loved Lucas Oil Stadium. It was huge, really freaking cool. Obviously, one of the best memories I have ever made. but I don't think there's going to be a single thing that tops an SEC environment, or a game in Eugene, Oregon, or a game in Spokane, Washington. There's not going to be anything like being at a college stadium, and I've never experienced that, so I'm determined to find that out this year. Just exactly what it is and what the experience is like. But to get back on topic, yes, Tennessee 10-2, losses to Alabama and Mizzou, but they do take down the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, the next Bulldogs, Mississippi State, 9-3, really good season for them. They have a really good quarterback coming back, kind of a tricky head coach situation, rest in peace, Mike Leach, great guy, love the guy, really sad to see him go. But this season, great quarterback coming back, but they do lose to South Carolina, who's a good team, LSU and Alabama, obviously top tier SEC teams. I don't think there's any way Mississippi State can beat them, but they have a great season, 9-3. They're going to make a really good bowl game. Chance for a 10-win season with a bowl, but great season for the Bulldogs, the Mississippi State Bulldogs, that is. But great season for them. Just a few losses that are expected if you're a Mississippi State fan. Moving on to Mizzou. Yes, Mizzou is up here with all these good teams. They go 9-3. They lose to LSU, South Carolina, and Georgia. Yes, Eli Drinkwitz takes the Tigers from Columbia to a really good bowl game. They beat Tennessee at home, but they do lose South Carolina. Just really great season for Eli Drinkwitz. They're going to use Luther Burden, former 5-star wide receiver. Use him a lot. Brady Cook, I feel like he's going to take a step forward. I know that's kind of the only way to go, but their defense is going to be great. I really think they're going to be really good. They got to perform because they have Williams-Nwaneri in the class. They got to perform to keep him because, he committed to Mizzou, and a few days later he's already wearing Oklahoma stuff. Yes, it does match his Lee Summit North High School colors, but you don't want your recruits wearing other schools' gear after they've already committed. But Mizzou got to perform this year. I feel like they have a good shot at Ryan Wingo this year too, and if they can say Ryan Wingo takes his recruitment into December, and it's kind of looking that way. I don't think he has a date set for a commitment, but say he takes into December, he wants to go on a few official visits over the fall, and he goes to Mizzou during Tennessee. And then Mizzou knocks off, top 10 team in the country, beats Tennessee, and everyone rushes the field. You know how much Ryan Wingo is going to love that? You know how much they need to perform this year to get those 5 stars? Because Mizzou's recruiting 5 stars now, apparently. But they have to perform for those recruits, have to have a good season this year. I think they're really going to, finishing 9-3, beating Tennessee, but losses to LSU, Georgia, and South Carolina. Kind of expected again if you're a Mizzou fan. Moving on to one more team, Texas A&M. How do you think they did? I usually talk about the good teams, but Texas A&M, pretty popular team. Talked about them a few weeks ago whenever we talked about the Johnny Manziel doc. They go 5-7. I really do not believe that Bobby Petrino, Jimbo Fisher marriage is going to work out. I really don't think it is. I don't really believe in Jimbo Fisher as a head coach. I just don't think they're going to be that good. I think the recruiting class is fake. It's all based off money. Half of them transferred last year. Just not really that good. They go 5-7. They lose to Miami in the out-of-conference game. And they lose to Arkansas. Just kind of, iffy. And then Alabama, Tennessee, guaranteed losses, I think. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, LSU, all tough games. But I really don't think they're going to win any of those games. They're just not that good. Way overhyped every single year. Just not a Texas A&M believer. But in summary, we have Georgia making the college football playoff as a 12-1 conference champion and a loss to Tennessee. LSU having an undefeated regular season but a loss in the SEC championship to Georgia. Then Alabama misses out on the playoff for the second year in a row while they lose to LSU. Now, as you heard, there is a 11-1 team in the Big Ten that makes the college football playoff. I bet you're wondering who that is. I bet you're wondering if it's just one 11-1 team. You know that there's 2 Big Ten teams that make the playoff because there's only been 2 teams to make the playoffs so far, and the Big Ten's our last conference to talk about. So I bet you'd say Michigan and Ohio State. One of them is 11-1, one's 12-0. Penn State goes 10-2, and it's just like last year. Well, you'd be wrong. Michigan is the undefeated champions, only undefeated team in the country. I'm going to be honest, guys. I tried my hardest to be unbiased in this. I looked at every game. I look at weaknesses. I look at strengths. I think I did a good job of being unbiased. It's going to seem like I didn't. I know this. But I really tried my hardest to be unbiased. I looked at offensive line strengths, defensive line strengths, DBs, which team is better? Who do I think is going to win that particular game? And yes, I have Michigan as my undefeated conference champions in the college football playoff, in the Big Ten championship, winning the Big Ten championship. Yes, I have my team going undefeated and winning the Big Ten. But I really, really believe that it's going to happen. It's not just speaking from the heart. No, this is my brain. Fandom out of it. This is what I think is going to happen. Michigan goes undefeated. Penn State, we'll talk about them in a second. Your conference runner-up is Wisconsin. They go 11-2. They lost to Ohio State and Michigan. Michigan in the championship, obviously, but they lost to Ohio State in the regular season. And I bet you're thinking Ohio State had a good season. I bet you are. Well, it's whatever. You'll find out in a second. Wisconsin is your runner-up only because they were in the West. They are 11-2. There is 2 teams that are better than them, finish higher than them in the postseason polls. But Wisconsin's your runner-up. Iowa ends up going 9-3 with losses to Penn State, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. Maryland goes 9-3. Losses to Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State. Nebraska 8-4. Losses to Minnesota, Michigan, Maryland, and Wisconsin. So Nebraska has a great rebound year with Matt Rule in his first year at Nebraska. I really believe in him. I think he's going to do great things at Nebraska. Great first year for him. Maryland 9-3, a great season for them. I think this is their best team that their head coach has ever had with them, but they're just nowhere near the level of Michigan, Penn State, or Ohio State. Yep. So I do believe that they are going to lose all 3 of those games. Iowa, they go 9-3, losses to Penn State, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Nebraska beats a really good Iowa team that has to get to 24, 25 points a game unless they don't want their offensive coordinator around. Well, I don't know if they do that, but they go 9-3. They beat a lot of good teams, but lose to the really, really good teams. Penn State, Wisconsin, Nebraska, just think they're better than them. I think they're going to win the game. Matt Rule is going to be a great coach in Nebraska, but Iowa, a really good rebound season from kind of a disappointment. Having such a good defense, but such a bad offense, but good rebound season for the Hawkeyes. Now, I mentioned Penn State earlier, but decided to wait to talk about Penn State and Ohio State until the end. Ohio State has already beaten Wisconsin, Maryland, and Notre Dame, so they have at least 3 wins. Good for Ohio State. Well, Penn State has 11 wins. They're 11-1 after the regular season. I'm going to let that sit in for a second. Penn State's 11-1. They lost to Michigan because Michigan's undefeated. So, Ohio State is 10-2 with losses to Michigan and Penn State. I know everyone's going to call me biased about this, but think about it. How many times do you see that team that kind of just starts off really hot? Their first half of the season's really, really good. They're blazing hot. They go in to some really, really good team and they beat them. That's going to be Penn State this year. They are going to walk into Columbus, beat the Buckeyes, and I think they're going to be riding high. They're going to be feeling great. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, we got Michigan at home. That's the only tough game we got left. We got this in the bag. Nope. Boom. Punched right to the gut. Michigan beats them in Happy Valley. But Penn State is that 11-1 Big Ten team I talked about that makes the college football playoff. I just think the college football committee would take Penn State over the SEC in this scenario. I think they would make it in over Bama just because I don't think anyone would want to sell 3 SEC teams and a Big Ten team. I think they're going to know for the good of the future of the sport, they're going to put a Big Ten team in over that SEC team to make it at least appear like they're even, 2-2, just like it could have been last year if Alabama, took care of business late in a couple of games. But Penn State, 11-1, makes the college football playoff as the 4 seed. Michigan, 12-0, 13-0, makes the college football playoff as the 1 seed. Now, getting to the end here, the college football playoff. As you guys know, I've said it already, the 1 seed is Michigan, the only undefeated team left in the country. Georgia, the 2 seed, after winning the SEC championship, going 12-1, only lost to a really good Tennessee team. 3 seed, LSU, one of 2 teams with an undefeated regular season, but they lost in that conference championship. And then, as I just talked about, Penn State. They make the playoff for the first time under Coach Franklin. Now, who is in the national championship? Well, it's a Big Ten versus Big Ten, SEC versus SEC. Michigan beats Penn State for the second time this season. They make the national championship. Georgia, LSU. Both teams have played already. They already played for a trophy. They played in the SEC championship. Couldn't get a bigger stage other than the stage they're on for this game. LSU gets the revenge over Georgia in the college football playoff semifinal. They are on to their second ever college football playoff championship game against Michigan, who's in their first ever college football playoff championship game. Now, we have the 1 seed versus the 3 seed. Michigan, LSU, 2 great teams, 2 great quarterbacks. J.J. McCarthy has had to win Michigan a couple of games in Ohio State and Penn State. Both those games will be very close, unlike the past 2 years against Ohio State. But J.J. McCarthy shows that he can do it, shows that he can go out and win a game on his own, and they do that. They do that 3 times against Penn State, Ohio State, and then Penn State again. They have made the college football championship with a great defense, a polarizing offensive line, and the best run game in the country. Second is Penn State, obviously, 2 great running backs, but Big Ten has a great running game, and I think Michigan has the better one, so they beat Penn State. They are the team with the least amount of questions in the entire country this year. The only question I have for this Michigan team is cornerback number 2, and I think we've got it covered. We got some really good reserves on the bench right now that are going to step up on opposite sides of Will Johnson. We'll have Mike Sanderstill in the slot. He'll be a great corner. You saw it against Cade Stover in the Ohio State game last year. He had a great play in the end zone to stop a touchdown. But I think our defense is going to be really good. Our wide receivers are going to be good enough. And then obviously the run game. That's the main focal point of the Michigan team. Great offensive line. 2 best running backs in college football. They're going to dominate the line of scrimmage with a great defensive line, great offensive line, and they're going to run right through you. Now, LSU and Georgia. Why do I think Georgia loses to LSU this time? Well, I think LSU is just a better team. I think they have a good QB, great weapons, obviously great defense. They always do. I just think they get the better of them the second time. I know I have Georgia beating them the first time, but I think they get the revenge. Kind of, that chip on their shoulder, like this team already beat us once, we're going to beat them this time. LSU beats Georgia in the semifinal to move on to play Michigan in the championship. Now, who wins these games? I just talked about Michigan. Great team. LSU. Great quarterback in Jaden Daniels. great wide receiver in Malik Neighbors. But I don't think their defense is going to be good enough. They have great defense, obviously. They always will. They're an SEC team, always going to have a great defense. But I don't think they're good enough to stand up to Michigan's offense and how good that run game is, how good that offensive line will be. And I think Michigan does win the national championship this year. They're the only 15-0 team. And look, I know this is going to seem biased, but man, I just laid out the reasons why I truly believe that Michigan will win the national championship. I really don't think it's just a heart thing. Brain tells me that Michigan will win the national championship. Well, my brain's normally wrong. Probably won't happen. We'll see. It's very hard to guess the national champion at the beginning of the year. Last year, I would have said, oh, it's Alabama. Easy. Well, they didn't even make the college football playoff. So, that is it for episode 4 of the Scoring from the 50 podcast. I hope you guys did enjoy. I thank you guys so much for listening, and Michigan will be your national champions. Don't forget to subscribe and follow if you're listening on Apple Podcast. Also, go check out The Late Kick with Josh Pate. Great show. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays, 7 Central, 8 Eastern. Great show. It's where I get most of my ideas from. Go subscribe to them. We got to get to 200K before week 1. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.